Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about one of the primary shadow dynamics that undergird the current political landscape. Okay, so in this video, I'll be discussing one of the primary shadow dynamics that underlies the current state of politics. But before we get into that element of the video, I want to first get some things clear about the framing of the video first. Well, first, I want to define what I mean when I say the current state of politics. What I mean by the current state of politics is the increasing polarization between the left and right wing over the greater part of the past decade, and also all of the micro and macrocosmic dynamics that have arisen as a result of that. And in addition to this, how more and more people have begun to see political identity as more core to their self-concept. Now, what I mean by the shadow of the current state of politics are all of the underlying motives that lead to the intensity of that polarization and political identification, with a specific emphasis on the unconscious motives that don't really have a lot to do with politics at all. You see, in the same way that an individual has their own shadow and shadow dynamics that arise from what they've repressed and neglected within themselves, society has its own broader scale shadow dynamics that arise from what's been collectively repressed and collectively neglected. So that's what I mean by the shadows that undergird the current state of politics. Now, in terms of my intention for this video, my intention is to provide a kind of meta-commentary on the current socio-political landscape as opposed to me sharing my own political opinions. Now, I definitely have my own political opinions that are deeply cherished and strongly held, and there are political hills that I'm willing to die on every single time, and anybody who knows me well knows this about me. But this video is not about that. So this video isn't intended to convince you of a particular political viewpoint, but is rather intended to bring to light certain deeper emotional and psychological happenings that undergird the collective dynamics around politics that have arisen for our species in recent years. So this video isn't about political opinions at all, but is rather a video about the truths that undergird our political behaviors and what makes those political behaviors tick. And I might do more videos like this in the future where I go into more meta commentary, because I don't really feel like a lot of people are covering this from this more zoomed out meta perspective. And instead, what you find usually with political commentary is that they either go and they're advocating for one side or the other. But this is more of a zoomed out view of the actual social dynamic that we're in. Now, the goal of this video is to bring to light one of the main shadows that leads to the political polarization in today's society, and to promote depolarization in the individual and society alike. Now, when I say depolarization, I want to be very, very clear about what I don't mean. I know that oftentimes when people want to depolarize, oftentimes the way they think about this is on the level of politics. So they say, okay, you have the left over here and you have the right over here, and everybody just needs to just be more moderate and go toward the center. And ultimately, that's not my viewpoint. As I had mentioned before, I'm a very politically minded individual, and my view is that it's a very positive thing when people have values that they're willing to take a stand for. So when I say that I want to promote depolarization, I don't just mean that I think everybody should be more moderate with their viewpoints. I mean something different by depolarization that's not on the level of politics, but is more on an emotional and psychological level. And I'll talk more about this later in the video. And along with this, I'll also give a shadow work based exercise for depolarizing within yourself. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of what it entails to depolarize on that level, I want to get into the meat of the video first. So without further ado, what is the main shadow that causes all of this political polarization? Well, the main shadow dynamic underlying all of this is the unmet need for group belonging and community. You see, society is currently in a very atomized state, and most places are not set up for human interdependence and group belonging in the way that human beings have always lived. You see, human beings are naturally social creatures that have always had our needs met through belonging with a group. So if we think about going back all the way to nomadic times, we've always been interdependent with one another. We've always had community that we've interacted with on a daily basis. So group belonging has always been, and still currently is, the way that we meet the bulk of our needs, whether they be social and emotional needs or physical needs and safety needs. And because of this, the need for socialization and group belonging isn't just a need that we can forgo without experiencing some pretty intense emotional and psychological consequences. But currently, society is structured in a way where we can't meet those needs easily. We really have to go out of our way if we want to connect with people outside of our household. It's not so interconnected and interdependent like it used to be when we used to live in communities and groups. And this has gotten even worse with the invention of social media that gives us the illusion that we're meeting our group belonging and community needs without actually meeting them. And it's gotten even worse with the pandemic, which caused a lot of isolation. And all of this dynamic leads to a lack of community and deepening levels of isolation, which leads to a deep starvation for group belonging. And for many people, this need for group interdependence and socialization has been chronically unmet for such a long time that we start to repress that need altogether. Oftentimes, if we have a need that goes chronically unmet, we will repress the aspect of ourself that has that need to the shadow. And then we start to kind of orient in such a way where we don't really even feel like we have that need. We start to don't even feel like we miss it. And this is the way that many people in our society today are coping with disconnection and atomization by not even being aware that they have that need. But that need is still there underneath the surface. And this leads to the collective dynamic around the political polarization that I was talking about earlier. Now, there are many complex dynamics that have led to this isolation, from the invention of certain technologies like the internet to the change in urban planning that comes along with industrialization and post-industrial societies. But ultimately, the upsurgence of these new technological developments has just allowed something to come to fruition that's perhaps been bubbling there since the very dawn of our species. As I'd mentioned before, social belonging has always been the way that human beings have survived and gotten their needs met. And so it's always been a life or death matter with social belonging up until fairly recently in human history. So if you were rejected by your social group, you would either end up in exile, which in that case you'd be a total goner, or you would end up in some kind of negative social situation where you'd maybe be looked at like a social pariah, you'd be cast out. So ultimately, group belonging had really, really high stakes. And because of this, if somebody's authentic self happened to not fit with the rest of the group, they would have to essentially cut that part off of themselves and repress it away in order to try to fit in, because the consequences were just that extreme. And so with technology allowing for more people to be more self-contained, it's basically a lot of people probably just ran straight into the lifestyle of the hermit as soon as they could, because it allows them to fully be with themselves. It allows them to be fully authentic without having to worry about fitting into group dynamics. And this is probably especially true for anybody who would especially struggle to fit into the group generally. Now, in earlier human eras, this sacrifice of authenticity was necessary for group belonging and group cohesion, simply to survive. And so we can look at that as a sacrifice that has really built the foundations upon which our society has been built. But now that we're capable, it makes complete and total sense that people would run into the lifestyle of the hermit hard and fast and padlock the door to social interdependence behind them. And from this dynamic arises a polarization into individualism to the exclusion of collectivism, which means that we push collectivism into the shadow. And when collectivism is in the shadow, it doesn't just go away, it basically exerts its influence in ways that we're not conscious of. And so instead of our collectivist drives for group belonging being expressed in conscious ways where we're meeting those needs directly, oftentimes we're now expressing them in unconscious ways and trying to meet them indirectly. And so the shadow of collectivism still has its impact on people who have polarized themselves into individualism and who have embraced the life of the hermit. And with the archetype of the hermit, it's all about isolation. So on the positive side of the hermit, you have the dynamic of isolating yourself from the group so that you can find your own North Star, so that you can find the voice of your own authenticity separate from the distortions and pressures of the social group. And on the negative side of the hermit, you have social starvation, and a strong collectivist shadow. So we're currently living in this hermetic time, a time under the auspices of the hermit archetype, and with all of its pluses and minuses, I recognize it as a necessary step in the collective evolution of human society. And that's because the hermit is all about coming back to your own sense of authenticity and finding your own North Star. And this is something that human beings in eras prior to this weren't able to do quite to the extent that we're doing right now with all of this isolation. And so it sets us up for a future where we can get in touch with our deeper sense of self and come back and recoalesce into social groups without having to sacrifice that authentic element. So if before social groups were just people kind of like trying to keep themselves together at all costs, even if there were incompatibilities or somebody had to sacrifice their authenticity, ultimately that's the way that we used to coalesce into social groups, where there was extreme punishment for deviation from the norms. But now, since we've gone separate and now we're all quite atomized, we all come to know ourselves at deeper levels. And when we recoalesce again into social groups with more knowledge about how social interaction works and how to make, connections work out over the long run, we also bring that authenticity back into play. And so I see this hermetic time as very necessary for us to find ourselves during this time and to recover what had to be sacrificed in eras past by human beings in previous time periods. And we're in this position where we're quite privileged in the way that we can connect with those things and come back together later in a way that makes our social groups stronger, where people can be more authentic in those social groups. As essential as this hermetic dynamic might be to the lead up of that, it also causes many different problems in the interim of that setup of recoalescing into social groups where we can be authentic. Ultimately, one of the problems that comes about here is this strong collectivist shadow, this sense that we want to connect, we have this deep need to connect, that we've pushed away, that we've gone unconscious to for many of us, but it tends to come out in these other ways, like intense political polarization. Now, one of the expressions of the shadow of collectivism and the shadow of this unmet need for group belonging is the tendency to try to seek group belonging through in-group and out-group thinking. With in-group and out-group thinking, it's quite similar to the type of bonding experience had with people who are rooting for the same sports team together. So they're rooting for the good team and against the bad team. So it's being on the same side together and fighting the enemy. And with this sports team-based bonding dynamic, it's a lower stakes engagement of the type of bonding that comes about between soldiers fighting on the same side of a war against an enemy. And with war, there can be engagement of a particular hero-villain narrative or a hero-villain-victim narrative. And these good guy and bad guy narratives are very potent, and they're directly wired into us to create a deep collective bond around fighting an enemy together. And this is because this is the narrative that comes up for us whenever we're in a situation where our life is threatened or we're at war. Think of these good guy, bad guy narratives as an instinctual way to bond with our allies and to demonize our enemy. That way we can fight the enemy with our allies without any moral qualms. And that's exactly what these in-group and out-group narratives do. And that collectivist shadow of our group belonging needs that are unmet oftentimes engages this wartime hero-villain narrative so that we can name an enemy and find allies to be on the same group together. The main goal here is to connect deeply and bond deeply with our allies by naming off some other to be in contrast to. And in this case, the other is the opposite political side of the aisle. So instead of consciously being able to meet those group belonging needs, we now try to unconsciously meet them by engaging these hero-villain narratives. Now, with some people, this dynamic can be more obvious, where it's clear that the person really is just trying to toe the line of their political party, and it doesn't really have anything to do with their genuinely held values. But even for somebody who has genuinely held values, there can still be this dynamic that creeps up, where we might, let's say, talk ourselves out of one of our genuinely held values in order to toe the line of our political group. So we want to be very vigilant about our tendencies to do this, because ultimately it's quite easy to point it out in the other if we say, oh, I can see how the other side of the political aisle is doing that. But it's difficult to point it out when our side is doing it, and it's even more difficult to point it out when we are individually doing that. So recognizing this tendency toward in-group and out-group thinking and the underlying desire for group connection with it can be much more difficult to pinpoint out in yourself. And if we notice some of this tendency in ourselves to use in-group and out-group thinking in politics or in any kind of situation to create a deeper sense of group bonding, we want to notice the underlying drive towards social connections that's there and validate that need and seek to meet it consciously instead of engaging in the unconscious dynamic of in-group and out-group thinking to create that type of group bonding. Now, at this point in the video, I want to revisit what I was saying about depolarization earlier. So like I said, I don't mean by depolarization that you have to let go of your genuinely held values and just go more toward the middle or get wishy-washy about your political values. And I definitely don't mean being complacent in the face of harmful political behavior. Definitely keep your genuinely held political values, because when these political values are explored deeply to their core, they are an outgrowth of your authenticity. Now, what I actually mean by depolarization is to drop the in-group and out-group thinking and the labeling of one side as the good guys and the other side as the bad guys. And I even mean we should drop this sense of good guys and bad guys, even if people are on the opposite side of the political aisle are really engaging in negative authoritarian political behaviors. And certainly all of those negative things are within the realm of possibility. There are real stakes to politics. And if certain political viewpoints take hold, ultimately that's going to lead to negative consequences for lots of people. And it's important not to take that for granted. Politics is not a sports game. But ultimately, the reason why you want to drop these good guys, bad guys thinking about things, even in the face of negative political behavior, is because the good guys, bad guys narrative isn't real. It's not actually reflective of the truth of what's going on underneath what shapes our political decision making. And you have to know what's actually truthfully happening in order to enact positive change. You can only enact positive change if you see the real, deeper motives behind people's political behavior. Just like a doctor has to diagnose the right illness in order to provide the right medicine, anybody who wants to enact positive change in society has to actually diagnose the actual roots of the symptoms of the problems and deal with those roots directly, as opposed to trying to deal with the symptoms or as opposed to just ignoring the problem. And with the good guys, bad guys narrative, it's an inherent misdiagnosis of the problem. It is comic book fantasy thinking. So if someone's thinking that the opposite side of the political aisle are just bad for badness sake, then they're totally missing all of the social, emotional, and psychological factors that are shaping someone to make those political decisions. And no matter how destructive that person's political behaviors may be, they're never engaging in those destructive political behaviors simply because they are evil. All right, so let's take this to the utmost extremes of negative political behavior. Let's say that someone commits a terrorist attack or commits a hate crime to further their political agenda. Well, we could certainly call those actions evil, but if we diagnose the problem as, oh, that person's just evil and evil people just exist, it kind of hand waves off the problem. And so it stops us from actually being able to make changes in society that might minimize that type of political violence in the future. And it basically hand waves off the problem as, they're just bad people and bad people do bad things, which means that we can't really fix it in any other way than saying, okay, well then the good people should just go and get rid of the bad people. But in all likelihood, the person who was committing these acts of political violence was probably also operating off of this hero and villains mentality, where they were thinking of themselves as the hero that was coming in to defeat the villains and to make society better in some way. Typically typically authoritarian negative behavior like that comes from this sense of heroes and villains thinking. Not to mention, there's also usually a myriad of social forces that are kind of reinforcing that they are the heroes and valorizing this type of behavior. So understand that hero-villains narrative can really cause a lot of problems. And so if we apply the same mindset to solve those problems, we're just not going to be able to do it. We cannot fight fire with fire. And ultimately, everyone has this potential within us. Now, it doesn't mean everybody is going to go out and commit some kind of act of political violence, but everyone has the potential of being sucked into authoritarian thinking that justifies violent political behavior. And ultimately, if you think that you're exempt from that, then that makes it more likely for that behavior to take hold. So when we look at somebody who's engaging in destructive political behavior, whether it be more extreme or more moderately destructive political behavior, we want to make sure that we're not saying that, oh, I'm the good guy and I'm righteous and I would never do that and that person's the bad guy and shame on them and this type of thing, because ultimately it gives us a false sense of righteousness and it's a false sense of security that we won't go down the same path. Now, you may wonder why I use such extreme examples of violent political behavior, and what I find is that it tends to be more illustrative if I go to the utmost extremes of political behavior, because if you can drop the good guys and bad guys narrative with like the utmost extremes of negative political behavior, then it becomes quite a bit easier for you to drop the good guys and bad guys narrative when it comes to just your neighbor who's on the other side of the political aisle. So ultimately, the reason why we want to drop that narrative is not to greenlight any kind of negative behavior, but we want to drop that narrative because it's just not real. There are no good guys, there are no bad guys, it's just comic book fantasy thinking. And if we get caught up in these good guy and bad guy in-group and out-group narratives, we become more and more warlike in our orientation to the world, and it can even lead to us thinking that the only path to creating a better world is to become the hero that defeats the villains, to be the good guy that gets rid of the bad guys. And of course, this leads to all sorts of negative political behavior. So it's really important for us to depolarize and to drop the comic book hero and villain thinking and to get really deeply anchored into the truth of where people's political viewpoints and behaviors come from. Now, in terms of how to depolarize and let go of in-group and out-group thinking and hero and villain thinking, understand that a big part of this polarization comes from a demonization of the other in order to solidify our own identity of goodness. And this tends to lead through to something that I call within the realm of shadow work, oppositional splits. So oppositional splits is where we identify certain qualities as good and we seek to identify with those qualities so that we can deem ourselves a good person, and then we reject its opposite. So if let's say, for example, that I think that, let's say there's a polarity, let's say that there's seriousness, and on the other side of that polarity is something like being carefree. So let's say that I identify as a serious person, and I think that's the good thing. I think that serious people are credible and trustworthy, and that ultimately people on the other side of the spectrum, people who are more carefree, are just frivolous, they're lazy, they're untrustworthy. So I have kind of negative connotations around people being carefree. So I try to identify myself as much as possible with seriousness, and I carve out this identity for myself that I'm this serious person and I'm trustworthy. So seriousness is part of my identity of goodness. It's part of the way that I'm able to see myself as a good, worthy person. And to the extent that I have pushed away the opposite of that quality, so if I let's say every time I see somebody who's carefree and this type of thing, I tend to judge that person. Well, ultimately, to the degree that I judge other people for that quality, I'm going to push that away in myself. And if I start to see any of those qualities within myself, what's going to happen is I'm going to feel an intense degree of shame because I would be judging myself in the same way that I would be judging other people for that quality. And so when we have these oppositional splits, it's all about labeling a quality as good and hyper-identifying with that quality and then pushing away the opposite quality, which we're considering bad. And so ultimately, this is how we create polarizations from within our own being. And when it comes to depolarization, it's all about holding space for both of those opposites within ourselves and accepting their existence there. Now, when it comes to the current political polarization, this can lead to a lot of oppositional splits on the individual level. When looking out at the political polarization in society, we can see that it has the potential to create a lot of oppositional splits in people who are identifying very strongly with their in-group and operating through in-group and out-group thinking. So if a person belongs strongly to the right-wing in-group and it's all about getting that group belonging, or a person belongs strongly to the left-wing in-group and it's all about getting that group belonging, well, ultimately, what's going to be happening there is that there's going to be a lot of temptation or a lot of tendencies to say, oh, my side of the political aisle are the good ones, and so I want to have all of these qualities and I want to get rid of all of those qualities. So it can create a lot of shadow dynamics within ourselves because of this reason, because we're polarizing to one side and we're excluding the other side. For example, if I'm someone who identifies as belonging to the left-wing political in-group and I'm doing so for the sense of group belonging, then ultimately I'm going to try really, really hard to fit to the norms that I ascribe to the left wing, and I'm going to try to reject the norms that fit to the right wing. So, for example, if I view the right wing as being very traditional in nature, let's say, and I might, let's say, have parts of me that would genuinely resonate with being traditional, but ultimately, if I'm really, really trying to fit into this left wing in group and I see it as being too much like the enemy group, then I might have a tendency to repress this sense of traditionality within myself and polarize myself to the opposite side of the spectrum. And so basically I create this oppositional split within myself where I say, okay, traditionality, bad, and then maybe the opposite side of that would be something like iconoclasm. So I say iconoclasm, good, traditionality, bad, and I start to build an identity of goodness around iconoclasm. And around that, I can even, let's say, see myself as kind of a free thinker, and I start to kind of think about how I don't kind of just go along with the crowd. And I start to see like traditionality as being like, it's okay, these norms are arbitrary, it's just a bunch of people following a bunch of rigid rules, people can't think for themselves. And maybe I start to associate traditionality with, like, let's say the worst extremes of it, where it's like you judge other people that are not part of your community of origin and this type of thing. And so I start to see the traditionality in a very negative light, and I start to see iconoclasm in a very positive light. And ultimately what happens as a result of this is that maybe I can't even appreciate holidays anymore, or I can't necessarily appreciate things about the traditions in my culture that I would otherwise be able to appreciate if I were in touch with those parts of myself. But because I'm in this in-group and out-group thinking, to even have a little bit of what the opposite side has would be seen as potentially compromising your values or compromising your place within the in-group. And now all holidays just feel like scams that were put out there by the candy companies to sell more candy, and I can't really derive the kind of meaning that maybe I used to derive from certain celebrations, certain rituals, certain holidays that I did prior to this identification. Or let's take the mirror opposite oppositional split. So let's say it's somebody who really, really wants to belong to the right-wing in-group. And maybe they specifically even want to belong to a segment of the right-wing in-group that subscribes to very traditional values. And so they really, really value traditionalism. And if they look at someone's behavior, like the example from before, where a person's being very iconoclastic and rejecting traditions, not only do they see that person as missing out on more meaningful experiences, they see someone as deviating from the right way to do things. So basically, if there's this sense that the traditional way is just the right way and then any other way is the wrong way, well, ultimately what that's going to do is that a person is going to polarize to one side and start to build an identity of goodness off of traditionality, and to say, okay, I'm the good person because I'm the one that sticks to the rules. I'm the one that does what they're supposed to do. And then basically to the exclusion of the opposite side of that. So basically on the opposite side, You would have iconoclasm that would now be stuck in the shadow, and also all of the positive qualities associated with iconoclasm. So for example, if a person is in a particular traditional social group, and the expectation is that you get married and have kids by the time you're 25 years old, but that person's just not quite ready to do that, or maybe that doesn't resonate with them very much, then they might have a tendency to kind of gloss over their sense of boundaries there in order to fit more with the traditionalist social group. And so ultimately, there would be a fear of, like, let's say if there's a strong judgment toward people who are deviating from the norms of traditionality, and if there's a strong judgment there that that person's giving, they'd be afraid that that judgment would come back on them. And there would be a feeling of shame associated with anything that deviates from the norms of that tradition. Now, of course, these examples are not meant to exemplify everyone on the right and everyone on the left. There's plenty of people who are on the left that aren't resistant to traditionality, and there's plenty of people on the right who are not very traditional. I just use these as examples as potential people that might fall into the categories of being left and right, but they're by no means a monolith. But ultimately, with both of these examples, where a person is identifying strongly with iconoclasm as the cornerstone of their identity of goodness, and the other person is identifying with traditionality as the cornerstone of their identity of goodness, ultimately, they're both repressing parts of themselves in order to maintain that identification. And it's the identity that we're really trying to preserve there. When we're doing this, we're trying to craft our identity in such a way that we can think about ourselves a particular way, and in this case, be seen by others in the group as possessing some kind of virtue. So in a sense, when the person goes, oh, I'm really iconoclastic, for other people that resonate with that, let's say that they're in a social group that happens to really resonate with that. It's all about the belonging within that group. Or if the person is belonging to a group that's really, really traditional in nature, then it's all about, how do I stay connected to that group? How do I belong to this group? How do I keep to the norms of these traditions? And if these two individuals encountered one another, if they both had really, really strong oppositional splits, they would probably have deeply, intensely negative reactions to one another. Whenever we meet someone who's polarized in the opposite direction, it tends to create very polarizing feelings. And this is what's basically happening on the collective level, where we have a certain number of people on the left and a certain number of people on the right who've strongly built a group identity. And ultimately, it's not the values, it's the group identity that creates this polarization and that sense of in-group and out-group thinking. And there are certain qualities that coalesce around these group identities and certain out qualities. So it's identifying with the way that we are and the way that we aren't. And so whenever we have one group that's rejected certain types of qualities and the other group that's rejected certain types of qualities that happen to match up with the opposite group, then what's going to happen is that there's going to be a lot of tension between the groups. So in order to depolarize within society, we actually have to depolarize within ourselves first. That means being able to recognize the value of everything that we're identifying with and its opposite. So if I'm the person who identifies with iconoclasm, I have to be able to drop resistance to traditionality, even if it's never going to be my favorite thing, even if I'm always going to prefer iconoclasm more. I want to be able to see what it is that motivates people to move toward the path of traditionality. What is it that people are getting from it? And then just to find the fundamental human core that, let's say if I'm that person, that I can relate to, that people who are, more geared toward traditionality might find resonant. So maybe somebody who identifies with traditionality might find it very comforting to have certain tried and true sort of paths to go down. Maybe it's the case that there's a kind of sense of social connection that comes from engaging in a tradition together. Maybe it helps them bond with their family more. Maybe it gives them a sense that they're on the right track and it gives them a sense of certainty. And ultimately, all of these deeper motives are something that are very human and very easy to relate to, even if I don't really particularly like the vehicle that the other person is using to go toward those ends. And so when we can actually look and see the value that another person might be deriving from whatever we've disowned, disidentified with, and pushed away, then we can start to understand the deep human core of what motivates certain political behaviors, and we can start to depolarize within ourselves and in relation to others as well. And in order to do this, what you'll want to do is you'll want to find where you have oppositional splits. Specifically in this case, as it pertains to, let's say, the political polarization, if you find yourself identifying strongly with the qualities of one political group to the exclusion of the other, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to write down those qualities. And so you might say that, oh, I identify with these qualities are part of my identity of goodness, and I associate these qualities with the opposite side, and I've pushed those qualities away. So that could be one way to approach it, but you can also approach oppositional splits without thinking about it through a political lens as well, where you find yourself maybe identifying with some traits to the exclusion of the other. And ultimately, what you want to do is you want to look toward what the other opposite trait actually has that's positive. You want to look for the gems of that trait. So in the example of, let's say, the person who's in the really traditionalist perspective, who's totally pushed away sort of like, let's say, the iconoclasm that the other person is showing, where they're maybe kind of bucking certain traditional norms and kind of questioning traditions and things like that. So that person might ask certain questions like, how does identifying with iconoclasm serve someone? What are the fears and insecurities that iconoclasm helps assuage? What emotional needs do people meet through engaging with iconoclasm? What are the forces in a person's life that might influence them to identify with iconoclasm? And what elements of iconoclasm actually resonate with me? And you don't have to put iconoclasm there, of course. You can fill in the blank with anything that you want. And this can give you a sense for what human needs people are actually deriving from these things. So for example, if I go in and I ask myself this question, let's say, how does identifying with iconoclasm serve someone? Well, ultimately, as somebody who has in the past identified with iconoclasm, I can say that it's quite helpful in terms of like creative thinking. It's like you can really move in directions that other people haven't gone before. You really start to value originality and, moving in your own way and this type of thing. And there's like an association with like it takes a certain amount of critical thinking to do that. So basically, like there was like a strong identification with that. And if I were to ask that question in terms of how does identifying with traditionalism serve someone, I might say it's like, well, you get the sense that there's a tried and true path and that you're on the right track and you have basically probably a lot of social supports in going in that direction. So ultimately, both of these paths serve people in different ways. And so being able to see from the other side's perspective why it is that they've polarized into the identity that they've polarized into can be really important. And ultimately what we want to do is we want to start to drop the resistance to that other side's perspective by understanding and by exercising deep compassion and recognizing the deep human needs that these other qualities that we've rejected actually benefits people and how we could actually benefit from them ourselves. And once we cultivate a deep understanding as to why a person might resonate with something that we are resistant to or that we've repressed, what this enables us to do is to practice more compassion toward that other person and toward the parts of ourselves that we've pushed away. And through that compassion and the recognition of the deeper truth and humanity that underlies someone's perspective who's on the opposite side of the aisle, shame starts to recede in ourselves relative to those qualities that we've repressed. And from there, we can begin to recognize and integrate those qualities within ourselves in positive ways. And so this is how you depolarize using shadow work. You look to the other and you recognize both the positive and negative that's there and recognize that you also have that within yourself. And from there, the resistance starts to drop away and you become more and more able to integrate these qualities on a more positive level. All right, so as a recap to the video, there are 3 main points that I want to drive across. One is to be very, very connected to your political viewpoints, to know what it is that you believe, to know what it is that you stand for. And again, this is very different from the political polarization. The second thing is to make sure that you have your group belonging needs met. The group belonging needs are what tends to create the political polarization and the in-group and out-group thinking around that political polarization. And the third thing is to work with your oppositional splits. So if you notice yourself saying, I'm the good way and not the bad way, and identifying over here with an identity of goodness to the exclusion of what we've labeled as bad, whether it relate to politics or not, you can always depolarize within yourself. And if we can encourage more depolarization, this will essentially, on a more collective level, impact the political polarization on that level as well. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe, and leave me a comment down below. And if you would like to check out my shadow integration masterclass, it's totally free. Just go to the link shadowintegration.org/masterclass. And until next time, keep becoming more you.